talk by James Scott. I'm John Silva. I'm the director of the Ortigas Library. And just a little advertisement on Ortigas Library. We have an incredible collection of 23,000 volumes of books, paper, prints, ephemera, etc. And we're open to the public from Mondays to Saturdays. We invite everybody to come. And we're very strong on civilian life under the Japanese occupation. For some reason, our president, Mr. Ortigas, Rafa Ortigas, seemed to have collected a lot of World War II material. And so James researched here several years ago, so we're very proud of that and helped him. And he also met with Mr. Montilla, who is one of our trustees. Mr. Montilla has an extensive World War II material and gave him a book on Heart and Drop, which is the most famous book on the occupation or the living standards of people in UST. So, and for tonight, Mr. Montilla eagerly wanted to show off many of his maps, a few of his maps. Many, it's an understatement. There's a few of his maps. There's these maps that are of Manila prior to World War II, and then there's some maps over there, and then there's maps owned by, or originally owned by, Carl Meidens. Carl Meidens was the famous photographer who took the arrival of MacArthur in Lingayen, along with Romulo, and he also took pictures of the UST when it was being liberated. So Carl Meidens is a very important photographer. We accept books. Just one last thing is we accept books, and we in turn give it to our public school libraries throughout the country. So if you got any books out there that you know it's clogging up your room, do your Marie Kondo thing and just start moving them out, and we'll take them because we will distribute them to libraries throughout the country. I wanted to say that when I was growing up, I always wondered, because I'm a photo historian, why we did not have photographs of the family before 1946. Everything started 1946 and up, only to be told later that the house was burned down, just like that. So, and then when I was growing up, many of our house servants would tell us about evacuees and people being murdered. We'd walk a street and they say, sir, over there, that's where they killed. So that also had an impression on me. Then when I was growing up, one of my best friends was Tommy Lichauco, whose parents were Jessie and Marcial Lichauco. And over dinner and lunch, Marcial would always tell us about how in World War II they took care of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in the last days of the liberation, find medicine for them, etc. And I always thought I was quite touched by the Lichauco caring for so many people. And then I remember hearing about Fort Santiago. Classmates would tell me, oh, my uncle was in Fort Santiago and he disappeared. And then I remember we lived in Ross Boulevard or Dewey Boulevard, and my yaya would take me on a motorco, the two-decker bus, and we'd go all the way to Intramuros. And in Intramuros, I'd see all these bombed-out buildings and destroyed buildings. I'd say, what's that? And my yaya would just be very terse and say, the guerra. And then that was it. So, and when I was in the National Museum, I found out that 95% of our artifacts were gone. When I did a study on the Tanduay distillery collection that was given to the National Library, I found out that, again, 95% of the book collection was gone because of the war. So all of these random things that I learned when I grew up and now, it never really came condensed or put together until James Scott's book, Rampage. Rampage was what really clarified everything to me, that the whole thing that happened in Manila was, and he says things like extermination of people, and total destruction of the city. Now it was no longer random or incomplete, but rather that it was a very, very painful thing. And that's why my parents never wanted to talk about World War II. There was like a trauma. Nobody wanted to speak about it until the 70s. I know that nobody wanted to buy Toyota cars in the 60s. Anything Japanese. So the book brings it all together. And I am very happy that James Scott is here. And I don't want to speak any further because I've heard him speak at the U.S. Embassy, and I think we were all quite dazed by what he did. So, without any ado, here's James.
Good evening. How's everybody doing this evening? Good. Well, thank you guys for coming out on a Friday night to have a history lecture. I really appreciate that. And before I start, I'd like to say a quick thanks to the Ortigas Foundation for having me here tonight, and also for helping me several years ago when I was here doing all my research. And really, it was John that was just a tremendous influence to me, and opening up the archives here and pointing me in the right directions. And in fact, I'd actually met his sister Marie a few years ago when I was doing research in the National Archives, so I kind of got to know both of them over the course of this. Through John, I met Mr. Montilla, who's here this evening, and whose maps are on display in the back, and who quite possibly has the finest World War II collection of any of books I've ever seen. So, and I got a real treat to get to visit his home and see that when I was here. We also, this week's been a really powerful week, I think, with going around and talking at different schools, different places. I've got an opportunity to meet a lot of Battle of Manila survivors, and I think it's such an important story. And it's been wonderful to be able to interact with folks I hadn't met before this evening. So thank you all for coming out and for that. The 29-day battle to retake Manila in February 1945 proved a fight unlike any other in the Pacific War. A bloody urban brawl that forced American soldiers to battle block by block, house by house, and even room by room. The end result was the catastrophic destruction of the city and a rampage by Japanese troops that terrorized the civilian population. Landmarks were demolished, neighborhoods torched, countless women raped, their husbands and children murdered. Not only did this battle give American war planners a glimpse of what might await troops if they had to invade the Japanese homeland, but those brief weeks in February 1945 forever transformed a city once known as the Pearl of the Orient and decimated generations of Filipino families, the ripples of which still echo through lives even today, 74 years later. Now, to truly appreciate the tragedy of the Battle of Manila, it's important to rewind to the turn of the 20th century. The United States had captured the Philippines along with Cuba during the Spanish-American War. But unlike Cuba, which we granted independence, America decided to hold on to the Philippines. The rationale for that was best described by Arthur MacArthur, who was General Douglas MacArthur's father, and who'd helped capture Manila during the Spanish-American War and served as an early military governor here. Quote, the archipelago, he told Congress in 1902, is the finest group of islands in the world. Its strategic position is unexcelled by that of any other position on the globe. Now, policymakers realized that Manila, which would serve as the nation's front door to the business markets of China, India, and Malaya, needed a facelift to better attract industry and help reflect America's growing global status. To spearhead that transformation, the U.S. hired famed municipal planner and architect Daniel Burnham, who over the course of his career helped cities like Washington, D.C. He actually helped with the redo of the National Mall there. He's the architect who designed Union Station, which is the big transit hub still in use right there at Capitol Hill. He helped out San Francisco and Chicago. In fact, he took his idea for Dewey Boulevard here, and it later became Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. Now, Burnham saw incredible potential in Manila, with its vast natural resources, its centuries-old Spanish churches, and of course the ancient walled city of Intramuros, the 160-acre historic heart of Manila, built soon after the city's founding in 1571. Quote, possessing the Bay of Naples, The winding river of Paris and the canals of Venice, Burnham wrote, Manila has before it an opportunity unique in the history of modern times. The opportunity to create a unified city, equal to the greatest of the Western world, with the unparalleled and priceless addition of a tropical setting. Now, in the 4 decades leading up to World War II, Manila developed into a small slice of America, home not only to thousands of U.S. service members, but employees of companies like Ford, Studebaker, Westinghouse, General Electric, B.F. Goodrich. Often called the Pearl of the Orient, the city boasted a great quality of life, with department stores, social clubs, golf courses, and swimming pools. Quote, Manila is by far the most beautiful of all cities in the Orient, the New York Times wrote in 1932. From the top of the University Club, it seems half hidden in a canopy of trees, green everywhere, a city within a park. On the eve of World War II, one of Manila's most prominent residents was none other than General Douglas MacArthur, who lived with his wife and 4-year-old son in the penthouse atop the Manila Hotel. Like his father, Douglas MacArthur's life was long intertwined with the Philippines, where he'd served often throughout his career, beginning with his graduation from West Point in 1903. Quote, in this city, MacArthur once said, my mother had died, my wife had been courted, my son had been born. For MacArthur, the son of a career military officer who'd spent much of his life pinballing around America and the globe, Manila was really the closest thing he had to a hometown. But it was more than just Douglas MacArthur who enjoyed it. Quote, to live in Manila in 1941, remembered CBS News correspondent Bill Dunn, was to experience the good life. But that good life ended on December 7th, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and invaded the Philippines. Hoping to avoid a bloody battle for the capital, MacArthur declared Manila an open city and evacuated his forces to Bataan and the fortified island of Corregidor. For MacArthur, this was far more than just a strategic retreat. He was abandoning his home, forced to reduce the contents of his entire penthouse to just 2 suitcases that the family could take with them. They walked out the door that day with the Christmas tree still standing in the corner of one room. Japanese troops fanned out at the capital in early January 1942, rounding up the thousands of American, Dutch, British civilians and interning them at the University of Santo Tomas. These internees came from all walks of life, all backgrounds, doctors, accountants, school teachers, even golf pros. The captives hustled to transform that 50-acre campus into a functioning small city, building latrines and beds, sewing mosquito nets and pillowcases. Internees even set up a school system for the 500 children held captive there. Despite that resourcefulness, conditions, as you might imagine, were pretty cramped. This is a photograph from inside the gymnasium. A sign on the wall of one bathroom read, quote, if you want privacy, close your eyes. Now, MacArthur endured 77 days in the tunnels of Corregidor before taking off on the March 11, 1942 in a torpedo boat with his staff and his family. For MacArthur, this was an agonizing event, forced to leave behind thousands of Filipino and American troops who had trusted him, and would soon face the Bataan Death March, followed by years in Japan's notorious prisoner of war camps. Upon reaching Australia, MacArthur made a public promise, I shall return. And those 3 words would drive him as the weeks turned to months and then to years. Now, Manila suffered greatly during the 3 years of the Japanese occupation. Japanese officers seized homes and cars from residents. Others looted food supplies in department stores, stole farm equipment and left fields to rot. Grocery store shelves sat empty. Basic necessities like medicine vanished. Felipe Buencamino, writing in his diary, captured the frustration of many. Quote, what kind of an army is this that fights a war with pianos and nice residences? As the years passed, Manila's economy collapsed, and the social fabric here began to unravel. An army of beggars soon flooded the streets, while others resorted to thievery, including the plundering of graves in search of gold teeth, jewelry, dentures, eyeglasses, even clothing. Anything that could be bartered or sold to buy a fistful of rice. Families unable to care For their children went so far as to abandon them to orphanages or even sell them. Starvation, meanwhile, ran rampant, claiming as many as 500 souls a day. Marcial Lichauco, a Manila area attorney, whose diary captured the horror many endured, described it in December 1944. Quote, "Today we are living under conditions in which only the fittest among us can hope to survive." And for folks who might not be able to read it in the back, there's a quote here that I think says it. This is from an American intelligence report in 1944, August, that I think captures better than anything just how bad conditions had got in Manila. And it says, quote, "It is cheaper to buy a child than a hog in the city of Manila today." Now, American and Allied families locked up behind the gates of Santo Tomas suffered equally. That earlier ingenuity the internees had shown faded as the daily caloric intake plummeted. Starvation took hold. A medical survey conducted in January 1945 revealed that the average male internee had lost 51 pounds, the average female 32. To survive, desperate internees ate dogs, cats, pigeons, and even rats, which, as you can see from this diary entry, were selling for 8 pesos each on the camp's black market. Quote, "I was worried about a lump in my stomach," Louise Goldthorpe wrote in another one of her diary entries. "Then I realized it was my backbone I was feeling." By January 1945, the nearly 3,700 internees at Santo Tomas starved to death at a rate of 3 to 4 a day. These 5 internees lost a combined total of 273 pounds. Quote, "We survived on hope," one of them recalled, "hope that American forces would arrive." And those hopes were rewarded on January 9th, 1945, when MacArthur's forces returned, hitting the beaches of Lingayen Gulf in preparation for the 100-mile drive south to liberate Manila. Now, standing in MacArthur's way was Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, whose job was to turn the Philippines into a tar pit, to bog down America en route north in its march to the Japanese homeland. Yamashita had proven himself early in the war, seizing Singapore from the British and earning the nickname the Tiger of Malaya. But his rivalry with War Minister Hideki Tojo had led Tojo to park him on the war's sidelines all the way up in Manchuria. After Tojo was fired in the summer of 1944, Yamashita's career was resurrected, and he was sent to the Philippines. And just as MacArthur had come back to redeem his promise, Yamashita was equally certain of his fate. He had come to die. But he did not plan to do so in Manila. Instead, he divided up his forces into several commands and dispatched them into the jungles and mountains of Luzon to fight a protracted guerrilla war. In contrast, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, who commanded the Manila Naval Defense Force, had no intention of abandoning the capital, even if MacArthur had ordered it. Now, Iwabuchi had been a failed sea captain earlier in the war. He'd had his ship shot out from under him off of Guadalcanal, and he'd survived, which in Japanese culture had been a big disgrace. He'd spent much of the rest of the war parked behind a desk in Tokyo, until the deaths of so many other more capable seafaring officers had led to his career resurrection, and he was sent to Manila. And here in the capital of the Philippines, he saw an opportunity to redeem himself by creating an urban bloodletting similar to Stalingrad. To accomplish this, he divided his 17,000 soldiers and Marines into several geographic commands that covered northern, central, and southern Manila. Iwabuchi's ultimate plan called for a defense centered around Intramuros. Around the old walled city, he planned a perimeter of large concrete buildings, small fortresses really, designed to withstand earthquakes and typhoons. To make it even harder for advancing Americans, the Japanese barricaded the insides of these buildings with desks and chairs, going so far as to build staggered walls inside the hallways to slow the American advance. In addition, Iwabuchi's forces likewise booby-trapped intersections. This is the corner of what was Dart and Oregon streets, where the Japanese had set out 25 oil drums filled with concrete, sunk 16 railroad axles upright into the asphalt. It also planted landmines here and improvised explosive devices, all of which were then covered by a 50 caliber machine gun in this pillbox in the top right-hand corner. This is a photograph of another Japanese tank trap. You can see here they've actually taken two vehicle bodies and wired them together and then anchored them with a cable here on the tree. And again, more of these poles sunk upright to try to block anyone from going over. Now, to retake the city, American forces carved up Manila. The 37th Infantry and the 1st Cavalry would come into the city from the north. The infantry would cross the river and then hook toward the waterfront in the walled city. Cavalry would then come in and envelop Manila from the east and make a parallel thrust, while the 11th Airborne would come up from the south and close the city's back door. Now, despite these preparations, MacArthur was convinced that the Japanese would actually evacuate the city, just as he had done at the start of the war. He was so confident of this fact that he ordered his headquarters staff to begin preparing a liberation parade for Manila, down to picking the individual jeep assignments for senior officers. Complicating the challenge for American war planners was the mix of intelligence coming out of Manila. In early December, Filipino guerrillas had reported that Japanese troops appeared to be leaving the city. Trucks and supplies and things like that headed out. But by January, the messages had changed. By January, guerrillas were reporting the fortification of Manila, construction of pillboxes, planting of landmines, things like that. Residents who for 3 long years had waited and prayed for liberation watched the growing fortification of the city with alarm and even terror. Quote, "Defeat is a bitter pill that the Japanese will not swallow," one resident wrote in her diary. Defeat is the one thing that can make them turn into beasts. 6:35 p.m. on February 3rd, the American cavalry rolled into Manila, prepared to liberate the city. In the northern suburbs, troops were greeted as celebrities. And the same was true at Santo Tomas, where the cavalrymen arrived that night at 8:30 p.m. Internee Tressa Roca captured the excitement in her diary. Quote, "Before the men in the tanks knew what was going on, they were pulled out of them and lifted on the shoulders of our scrawny fellow internees. It was impossible to hold back the worshiping and joyous internees." That night, starving internees feasted on army rations, while the American troops spoiled the children with candy. Frank Robertson, a reporter with International News Service, described just such a scene in his first dispatch from the camp. Quote, "One of the most unforgettable things was the slow smile of wonderment on the pale, tense face of a little girl of 4, tasting chocolate for the first time." Of course, many in the city were starving as well, and American troops throughout the battle would find themselves swarmed by hungry civilians, including this young girl, clinging to a box of army rations. But the excitement over America's arrival proved short-lived. Iwabuchi gave the order on February 3rd, the same day the Americans reached Manila, to begin the planned destruction of the city. Incendiary squads swept through the districts north of the Pasig and began setting fires and dynamiting buildings. MacArthur's pilot, Dusty Rhodes, witnessed the scene from the air. Quote, "The spectacle was an appalling sight," he wrote in his diary. "The entire downtown section of the city was a mass of flames, flames rising more than 200 feet in the air. Residents grabbed what belongings they could carry and fled. General Robert Baitler, commander of the 37th Infantry, described it best in his report. Quote, "We were powerless to stop it. We had no way of knowing in which of the thousands of places the demolitions were being controlled. Big, modern, reinforced concrete and steel office buildings were literally blown from their foundations to settle crazily in twisted heaps. In addition, the Japanese blew all the bridges over the river which divided the city." After destroying the city's northern districts, the Japanese fell back across the river into central Manila, forcing American troops to cross the Pasig and begin what would prove to be an incredibly bloody urban fight. Block by block, American soldiers pressed deeper into the city, frequently slowed by the fortifications at intersections, which required troops to blast their way through the backs of adjacent buildings in order to attack the rear of a pillbox. Just as perilous were the fortified buildings, where the Japanese Marines used the higher floors to target the advancing Americans, often dropping Molotov cocktails onto the streets below. Quote, the preferred solution was to use cannons to blast the upper floors to rubble and then move in, one infantry officer said. An equally favored alternative was to burn the building. When these wouldn't work, riflemen moved in to take the building floor by floor. One of the worst such battles occurred for Rizal Hall. As American cavalrymen literally inched room by room, their backs pressed against the wall, hurling hand grenades ahead to drive out the Japanese. This went on for 2 days, and at the end of the second day, as the sun began to set, neither the Americans nor the Japanese still had control of this building, yet neither side would surrender and exit. So both instead prepared to hunker down inside the blasted remains of this education building. That night, around 1:30 a.m., as the American troops were sitting there awake in the dark, their fingers pressed on the triggers of their rifles, they began to hear the Japanese singing on the opposite side of the building. This is from their report. Quote, this commotion went on for about 45 minutes, culminating in a final burst of song and loud shouting, immediately followed by many reports of exploding grenades and dynamite charges. The cavalrymen continued to sit in the dark and listen. More singing, followed by more explosions, then silence. These detonations went off at half-hour intervals until around 4 a.m., at which time a lasting silence finally settled over the building. The next morning at daybreak, the Americans moved in to find that 77 Japanese Marines had blown themselves up while they listened to it. Now, MacArthur had refused to allow planes to bomb the city for fear of killing civilians, but he relented and permitted artillery after American troops suffered heavy losses crossing the Pasig. Quote, from then on, putting it crudely, we really went to town, recalled General Baylor. Over the course of the battle, American forces would fire more than 42,000 mortar and artillery rounds into the city. Between Japanese demolitions and American artillery, Manila was being destroyed from the inside and the out. Men, women, and children were treated below ground, where conditions inside cramped air raid shelters devolved as the hours turned to days. Bunkers built to house and single family often held multiple. And with so many bodies pressed so close together, the air inside stagnated and the heat soared. Hans Steiner, in a letter to his mother, recounted his experience. Quote, we lived like dogs, he wrote. All around us were fires and explosions. It was the best imagination of hell one could get. And of course, such shelters proved easy prey for marauding Japanese troops, who often lobbed hand grenades inside. That was the case for this gentleman here, who had his cheek blown off from shrapnel. Many others, however, proved too injured to walk, including this woman, who had to be placed in a basket by neighbors for transportation to an aid station. In his diary, Santo Tomas internee Robert Weigel described the parade of wounded who came to the university each day in search of help from the American doctors. Quote, they are so far beyond recognition that in many cases one can't tell whether they are men or women, boys or girls, dead or alive. Now, by February 9th, Iwabuchi realized that the fight was lost. The Americans were across the river and pressing deep into central Manila. At the same time, his fortifications along the city's southern border likewise threatened to collapse. At that point, the fight took a very evil turn, devolving from a battle over one of Asia's great cities into one of the worst human catastrophes of World War II. An examination of the timeline of the dozens of atrocities that occurred in Manila point to February 9th as the fulcrum on which the violence shifted from individual attacks against suspected guerrillas to organized mass extermination. American war crimes investigators would later tally 27 major atrocities just inside Manila. The Japanese tossed babies in the air, skewering them on the tips of their bayonets. Troops decapitated hundreds of others with swords and burned thousands to death alive. The lucky ones received a bullet. In one such example, Japanese Marines stormed the Red Cross headquarters, going room by room, shooting and bayoneting more than 50 refugees, including 2 infants, one just 10 days old. The Japanese likewise burned to death more than 500 other men, women, and children inside the German Club, a large social hall. Troops forced hundreds of other civilians into the dining hall at St. Paul's College, rigging the chandeliers with explosives and then dynamiting it, killing 360. I was actually at Ateneo yesterday, and there was a survivor of the St. Paul's College massacre there. In one of the more gruesome crimes, the Japanese converted a home on Singalong Street into a house of horrors. Troops cut a hole in an upstairs floor, then marched blindfolded civilians inside, forcing them to kneel over it. A Japanese Marine then cut each person's head off before kicking the body down the hole. War crimes investigators, by counting skulls, later determined that more than 200 men died inside that residence. 9, however, miraculously survived. These are photographs of 2 of them. And this is a sketch of the inside of that done in March 1945 by another one of the survivors. The atrocities went beyond murder. The Japanese rounded up thousands of women, locking many of them inside these 4 buildings, the last one being the Bayview, which is still there today across the street from the U.S. Embassy. I think it's technically a different building, but it's the same property and the same name. It was also Jean MacArthur's first home when she moved to Manila in 1935. There, in rooms where tourists had once enjoyed Manila's legendary sunsets, Japanese troops assaulted hundreds of women. Quote, "I was raped between 12 and 15 times during that night. I cannot remember exactly how many times," one victim later testified. "I was so tired and horror-stricken that it became a living nightmare." Japanese did not discriminate. They killed men and women, the old, the young, the strong, and the infirm. Alongside thousands of Filipinos, the Japanese slaughtered Russians, Spaniards, Germans, Americans, Indians, as well as 2 Supreme Court justices, the family of a senator, and scores of priests. Quote, "The list of known dead that has come to my attention sounds like a who's who of the Philippines," Marcial Lichauco wrote in his diary. Those residents who were able began that long march out of the city, a dangerous journey through an apocalyptic wasteland. It was a scene best described by Life magazine photographer Carl Meidens, whose some of his maps we have here tonight. Quote, "All morning we had seen the long files of people walking mutely rearward past the advancing infantry. Some of them limped with improvised wound dressings. Many of them walked, heaven knows how, with open wounds. The Americans were so inundated with escaping refugees that engineers had to build a catwalk over the pontoon bridge to help ease the flow out of the city. And by the morning of February 23rd, American forces had isolated the last of Iwabuchi's troops inside Intramuros and a handful of surrounding government buildings. The fight to retake the walled city began with a massive artillery barrage at 7:30 a.m., one so destructive that it blackened the sky, turning day into night. In 1 hour, American forces fired a staggering 10,000 mortar and artillery rounds into the 160-acre walled city. Every second of that bombardment saw an average of 3 shells fired, creating a continuous rolling thunder that for those civilians inside the walled city was like being caught up underneath a freight train. At 8:30 a.m., the artillery stopped and the assault troops moved in. Quote, "The ensuing silence," remembered one journalist at that moment, "seemed even louder than the bombardment." Once inside, troops discovered that the survivors were almost exclusively women and children. War crimes investigators later determined that the Japanese had killed an estimated 4,000 men inside the walled city in the days immediately leading up to the assault. The Japanese had locked many of them inside cells at Fort Santiago and burned them. Hundreds of others were found piled one on top of another, sealed inside the underground dungeons that dated back to the Spanish Inquisition. And many of the children rescued were now orphans, including these 3, one carrying a bucket of utensils, and the other, in the bottom corner here, a baby doll. But the battle was not over. America still had to eliminate the last of Iwabuchi's forces, holed up inside the handful of government buildings that ringed the walled city. America blasted the legislature with artillery at point-blank range and then sent in assault troops. The building fell at noon on February 28. Troops then pounded the agriculture and finance buildings. Iwabuchi decided to make his final stand inside the agricultural building. Quote, "If we run out of bullets, we will use grenades," he told his men. "If we run out of grenades, we will cut down the enemy with swords. If we break our swords, we will kill them by sinking our teeth in their throats." But Iwabuchi's vigor withered under the onslaught of America's merciless guns, which pulverized the columns and ripped gaping wounds in the concrete walls around him, exposing the building's sinuous veins of rebar. Iwabuchi had presided over one of the most barbaric massacres of World War II. His troops had wantonly slaughtered tens of thousands of men, women, and children in some of the most cruel and horrible ways. Survival was not an option, and he knew it. So Iwabuchi summoned the last of his remaining forces, and he apologized for leading them to doom. Quote, "If anyone has the courage to escape, please do so," he told them. "If not, please take your lives here." The admiral then retreated to his quarters on the main floor on the northwest side of the building, where, armed with a knife, he slit open his belly. A handful of Japanese troops did in fact surrender at that point, like this Marine, pulled from the agricultural building. But most, however, chose to die. And on March 3rd, 1945, 29 days after American troops first rolled into the city, the Battle of Manila finally ended. The fight to retake the capital had resulted in the deaths of 16,665 Japanese, the near total destruction of Admiral Iwabuchi's forces. MacArthur suffered a little over 1,000 killed and another 5,500 wounded. But it was the civilians who bore the brunt of the horror, with an estimated 100,000 killed, many slaughtered by the Japanese. Quote, "The dead were often so disfigured that the relatives had to identify them through clothes, cigarette cases, and even keychains. Those who found remains were the lucky ones. Others would have no resolution, a sentiment best captured in a letter by Santo Tomas and attorney John Osborne. Quote, "With a heavy heart full of pity, I have, during these recent days and weeks, observed the searchers, the seekers after lost loved ones. Daily they have gone out the gate, hoping to find some trace of relative or friend to change that dreadful uncertainty to certainty, that would be the certainty of death. First, they visit the site of the old home, now probably but a heap of ashes and broken walls. Then to the homes of relatives and friends for news of the lost. Finally, they just walk the streets, looking at the dead, who today are numerous." Over the city of Manila hung that awful stench of death. Worse than the smell, remembered Infantry Major Chuck Hen, was the taste of death, which settled on your tongue. Quote, "No amount of spitting," he recalled, "could clear it away." The battle for Manila had destroyed 613 city blocks, an area containing 11,000 buildings, ranging from banks and schools to churches and houses. More than 200,000 residents were left homeless. A post-war American survey estimated that the damage to Manila by today's figures would run more than $10 billion US. And beyond the structural losses were the cultural ones. From historic churches, museum paintings, statues, priceless literary works, archives, including even all the patient records at PGH. And of course, the economy was in shambles, a sentiment best described by Abraham Hartendorf. Quote, "The manager of one of the Manila oil companies, and speaking of rebuilding his plant, stated that he would have to begin again, at the beginning, with a land survey." More than anything, however, was that incalculable loss to the nation's precious human capital, made up of individuals like Nick Reyes, founder of Far Eastern University, who was murdered along with much of his family on February 9th. Just as destabilizing in the long run, of course, were the deep wounds left in so many nuclear families, exemplified by a child's loss of a mother or a parent's loss of their children or their parents. Amid this sea of destruction, MacArthur returned to the Manila Hotel to find his own home in ruins. Gone was his vast personal library of almost 10,000 volumes. Gone were his father's Civil War medals. Gone was his own son Arthur's baby book, a loss that crushed Gene MacArthur. Quote, "You wanted to know about my apartment at the hotel," Gene MacArthur wrote in a letter to a friend. "Of that, as well as everything else I know in Manila, it is gone." Now, General Yamashita remained elusive until the end of the war, when he walked out of the mountains and surrendered. He was put on trial in the fall of 1945 in the battered ballroom of the United States Embassy on Rojas Boulevard. He was accused of failing to control his troops. Yamashita blamed everything on Iwabuchi, even though evidence showed he was in touch with the admiral throughout most of the battle and could have intervened to stop it had he wanted to. Furthermore, Yamashita was no stranger to such horror. His own troops had committed similar atrocities after the fall of Singapore, while his own chief of staff in the Philippines, Akira Muda, had played a key role in the rape of Nanking in 1937 and 1938. Over the course of 32 days, the Battle of Manila was replayed before a panel of 5 judges and a total of 16,000 spectators, who jammed the courtroom, sitting shoulder to shoulder each day to watch this war crimes trial. A parade of 286 witnesses, doctors, lawyers, teachers, even gravediggers, testified about what happened in Manila. Yamashita was convicted on December 7, 1945. His dogged defense lawyers appealed his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but ultimately lost. On February 23, 1946, in a sugarcane field 40 miles south of Manila, Yamashita, stripped of all his military decorations and even his uniform, was hanged. Now, his execution did little to provide solace for the many victims who'd battle years of physical torment. Others wrestled with emotional wounds. Scores more struggled to understand the barbarity inflicted upon them. Quote, "It was just total hatred and savagery," recalled survivor Johnny Rocha. "You cannot explain it otherwise." Nearly a half-century after the battle, survivors formed an organization, the Memorare Manila 1945 Foundation, dedicated to preserving the story of the civilian sacrifices during the city's liberation. To memorialize those killed, the organization erected a statue in Intramuros of a weeping mother cradling a dead infant, surrounded by other dead and dying figures. The inscription on the base of that statue provides a powerful epitaph. Quote, "This memorial is dedicated to all those innocent victims of war, many of whom went nameless and unknown to a common grave, or never even knew a grave at all, their bodies having been consumed by fire or crushed to dust beneath the rubble of ruins. Let this monument be the gravestone for each and every one." Thank you all very much and I'm happy to take any questions if we've got them. John?